Hey, all those things. I am all those things. That was a really well spoken label. I'm all those things. So we're doing really well here in my game room where I come to get away from all those different activities that you mentioned. I have to get a refuge from some of those things sometimes. So I come in here and do online remote gaming because that's what the world's coming to. Yeah, I started off just as an avid AD&D fan and didn't really ever have any thoughts about publishing anything or getting into the writing field at all. I thought I was going to be maybe communications instructor, at some college and teach the importance of communication. So I understood the value of communication, but the more I started playing AD&D, just when I was a kid, and then into high school, I thought I wanted to do something more creative than that. And actually, my very first thing I ever had published, well before any novels or poems or anything, was a little side trek in Dungeon magazine when I was an undergraduate, and it didn't pay much at all. I think it's only like 3 pages long in length, that little side trek adventure. But I kind of got the bug at that point and thought it was so fun because people were paying me for something that I would do for free. You know, had Dungeon Magazine called up, and I forget who the editor was at that time. Might have been Roger E. Moore, but had they called me and said, "Hey, we'll take any adventure you want to write. We're not going to pay you." I'd give it to them. It's just so fun to write, and it's so fun to think that other DMs and places are taking their characters through some dungeon or wilderness setting that you created.
Right on.
And I always wanted to sit in on them and see, how the characters or how the players dealt with a particular challenge that I had written. So I was fortunate enough to kind of get my foot in the door sort of early before third edition came along and kind of changed that trajectory.
Wow.
Uh,
Yeah. So you, man, you jumped in the deep end, huh? Now,
yeah, yeah, kind of where we got our momentum is it was after a couple of those publications. They were having a contest in Polyhedron magazine, the
yes, I
Polyhedrons.
remember
Yeah,
polyhedron. Yes.
yeah, it supported RPGA, and they're having a contest for a module that was actually based in Greyhawk. And
Oh, that's nice.
yeah, so I wrote this module and talked all about Greyhawk and different names that people recognized, and I was so excited to do that. And then word comes, oh wait, we're selling ourselves to Wizards of the Coast.
Mm,
All those things we talked about will no longer happen.
yeah.
So we ended up revising that module, changing all the place names, and we sold that through Bill Webb and his Necromancer games, as it was at the time. So my very first module length thing, What Evil Lurks, was actually written to be played in Greyhawk.
Well, that's excellent. That's all the more reason for some of the hardcore 1E fans, and even 2E. We will give an allowance for second edition fans to pick that module up because that is a Greyhawk original. Just had to have some trim changed on it a little
Yeah,
bit.
we had to file the serial numbers off, so to speak. So it's recognizable, and I could send you a list. Hey, these are the names in the module. This is what it originally was when it was written for Greyhawk.
Nice. That's excellent, man. So you did What Evil Lurks. How was that received?
It was received really well. It was during that boom of D20. When they released that open game license, that was one
Yes.
thing that then Wizards did that we all appreciated because we could start publishing things.
Mm,
Bill Webb and Clark Peterson at the time were really kind of at the forefront of that, getting materials out before a lot of really big companies were able to. And he liked my weird train of thought because he's kind of into the spooky, creepy stuff, and that's the stuff that I was writing at the time. So we were able to get several products out through Necromancer Games. It was a pretty exciting time in the industry, really, if you're an independent writer.
it was, and I think a lot of companies, and I don't count Necromancer in this. The little bit I worked with you on Necromancer, and we'll get to that in a minute, but was that they definitely were quality over quantity. Um, other companies killed the goose that laid the golden egg, because I'm sure, as you recall, by like 2005, you could buy D20 product by the foot.
There was so much. There was just so much put out there. You go into the game store and there's just D20, every possible iteration that you could expect or want. And it was great if you were just into mass consumption of another book of magical items or another book of Ranger feats or whatever third edition was calling them. But there was such a glut that eventually it collapsed.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it was definitely it was a boom time. I mean, just at that time, before I had published anything myself, I could see, again, you go into a gaming store and it's just like, you know, yet another slightly tweaked fighter class, yet another list of spells, yet another list of magic items. And D20 proved, and as a writer of game stuff, I'd love to hear your opinion on this, but I was of the mindset that D20 proved that just because you can release the stuff that you have at your own tabletop or locked up in your noggin or whatever, does not necessarily mean you should.
You're right, yeah, because that boom coincided with our technological ability to self-publish.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and so between those two things, it was like you said, every game master with a thought in his or her head was like, wow, I can convert this to D20. I can slap the copy of the OGL on the back page, and I can self-publish this and put it out there. And some of the ideas might have been great, but there was really no editorial control over a lot of that. So you
Yeah.
never knew the quality of product you had in your hand. Is this going to be something great, or is this just going to be, wow, something that I've just wasted money on that really has no place in my campaign?
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel like that level of oversaturation and self-publishing. First of all, I'm of two minds about it. I think it was great because, as I've said before, I love going back and reading Dragon Magazine from all the way from the beginning and looking at the ads in the back, the little, single
I love
column.
those
Yes, single column width, 1 inch high, you know, uh, advertising like, oh, I have a role playing game just about guys who do heavy constructions. It's called Bulldozers and Building. Send a Sazy for
Yeah, right.
the
Yeah,
rules.
yeah. Send that
And you're like,
info. Yep.
whatever happened to that guy? Whatever happened to his game? That sort of thing. And we have now with the D20 glut, even though it's 15, 16 years in the rearview mirror, we have a very clear forensic trail. So one need never wonder now.
That's right. And there were some jewels out there too. I found some indie product that I think that's pretty clever. I don't know if I use it in my game or not, but it's clever, and I'm glad I bought it to support them. So if you have the patience to wade through that, it was really good. But as you said, that Bill Webb and Clark Peterson were really trying to put out some quality stuff that was in the vein
Mm-hmm.
of first edition AD&D. I think they've kind of got away from that later on because dollars are going to dictate where they go. But a lot of that stuff through Necromancer, it really was something that you might have seen in first edition. And I would always write in first edition, and then their editors would do the conversion for third edition for me.
Right on. Now this kind of brings us to an interesting point, because usually, like, I know most of the people I've had on my live streams, and we can get fairly chummy about things. But I think you and I have the almost unique distinction of having written together, worked on something. So it would be very easy for me to drone on for 20 minutes about the process of working on Elemental Moon with you. But I want to try something here, and hopefully I don't catch you too unawares. This is gonna, folks. This is gonna sound very self-aggrandizing, very self-serving, and I don't mean it to. How did you get? How exactly did you sucker me into writing Elemental Moon? And what was that? What was that process like?
So Elemental Moon, there we co-authored, and this it says Sword and Sorcery at the top, and Sword and Sorcery was actually an imprint owned by White Wolf at the time, and so they had the publishing arm, and then Necromancer Games, Clark and Bill knew the guys at White Wolf, and so they were able to get this distributed really widely because of the influence of White Wolf. So that's where you see Sword and Sorcery up here. It's the White Wolf imprint of fantasy. So yeah, so Bill and I write this Elemental Moon, and through the magic of the interwebs, you encounter people who not only have the same interests, but seem to, I guess, kind of pursue or look at that interest through the same lens.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that my least favorite thing about second edition, the rules are, similar enough that I could certainly make it work with 1E, but I like the voice of first edition. And I like reading that DM guide and knowing that there is an individual who wrote that, and I can hear him, and I can, in his words, it's idiosyncratic writing, as we all know. Mm-hmm. It's very, very much his thumbprint in those books. And so, I'm drawn to you as a gamer, though I'd never sat across the table from you face to face, because I could tell he likes that too. He's drawn to that first edition quirkiness as well.
Yes, my worldview was as far as gaming was definitely shaped by High Gygaxian.
It's true. And it's one thing to talk about it. Some people talk about it and kind of poke fun at it. But to me, that really, when I'm this kid and I'm reading this book and I'm like, wow, that sentence is crazy. I don't even know what that word means. Let's look it up. And I think, wow, this guy has taught me something. He's expanded my vocabulary. But when he's explaining this world, the voice it's written in is not a corporate voice. It's not a one size fits all. Let's write the player's handbook so it sounds very corporate and very balanced. It's like I could hear him telling me across his table how to play his game. And I really like that. And I kind of sensed that you like that too. And when I, looked at your stuff and I thought, wow, that really meshes well with how I write when I put down a story that's going to become maybe the framework for a dungeon. And I think that you kind of write those same passages. And I think we blended well together because I could do more of the flowery narrative stuff. Let's get our players in a happy spot. And then you could let's try to put those players through the ringer in this particular scenario.
Yes. And that was, I've taken to describing, like, when folks ask about Elemental Moon. And by the way, I just want to point something out. You can still buy Elemental Moon. It's still out there. This is not some impossible to attain out of print thing. As far as a print copy, Lance and I were talking about that. You could get that on eBay, but services like Lulu exist, and you can get yourself a bound copy today. But when I talk about the module, I call my half of it. Is that fair? Half. Anyway, my part of it, a vertical Tomb of Horrors. Just because that's what I went for. You said, Bill, I need high level and deadly, and I was like, I'm your man.
That's right. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was going to say that's not necessarily my strength, and knowing that we were playing to an audience that might not have ever read a first or second edition module, it was for the third edition crowd. We had to have some of those ways that are more narrative to get the story moving without being railroady, but then we got to have that old school feel. And so you grab this guy, Bill Sylvie, and you reel him in and say, hey man, I need this thing that's going to be deadly. Cause that really is one of the marks of first edition is sometimes you find yourself boxed in on all sides, and it's up to not necessarily something that you have on paper that's a character trait that you don't have to make some kind of check. It's up to the player ingenuity to figure out a way to get out of that challenge.
Yeah, and I think reeling in is a good analogy to use. There's something, and I don't know if you remember this. I remember it distinctly when we were working on Elemental Moon. Now, full confession, and this may shock the world to find this out, I don't really know my way around 3rd edition from a design standpoint. I played a lot in the early 2000s. My gaming group at the time, that was all they wanted to play, was some form of D20 fantasy, be it 3rd edition or we played the Wheel of Time game based on the Robert Jordan books. That was a pip that we did that campaign lasted almost a year. But so I just kind of take it for granted that, I took it for granted that things don't have to be so programmed, so designed, and the spoiler alert, there's a Lich at the end of my part of Elemental Moon. So in AD&D, if you are making a Lich, you start not with the entry in the monster manual. Well, look there for reference, because it denotes that the Lich is a magic user of at least X level and cleric of at least X level. So I made one of those in 3rd edition and then took the template Lich and slapped it on top of that. And what I had created was this 30th level monstrosity that could annihilate demigods with an eyebrow twitch. And Lance caught that and he's like, he's like, this thing, because Lich in 3rd edition is its own thing. It has just shit tons of spells, not just Lich powers, but spells on top of it. So I had a 17th level magic user, and I bolted a 17th level Lich on top of it. And Lance, I think it gave you pause, as I recall. You
yeah, well, I wasn't all that savvy on the 3rd edition rules as well, and so I'm trying to piece this together. And I thought, okay, we're way beyond the scope, I think, of the original part of the adventure. So there were a lot of adjustments, and that wasn't the only one. When we're trying to convert kind of our spirit for games into what was required, not only by 3rd edition, but what was hopefully was the vision of Bill Webb, who was kind of steering it all as well.
Right. And that brings us to an interesting point, because we have a question from Aaron Smith, who says, are you given a subject and an idea and told to do it and have freedom to put in what you want to, or are you given an outline that you have to stick to? And that dovetails nicely into questions I have about the writing process as it pertains to gaming. So if you want to field that one, Lance, because I just
sure.
That's my approach.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it depends on the publisher. But the best example I have is I got to work with Rob Kuntz, and that was one of the highlights of my writing career, because I remember reading about his terrible Iron Golem, in his famous module that he wrote back in the 80s, and I always had that particular scenario in mind, and so an opportunity comes to work with Rob Kuntz, I jump on that, and he gave me the general idea. He said, I want to have there to be a tower underground, and instead of the players exploring a tower from the bottom up, because they're coming from the surface world, they land on the top of the tower, and they're going to go down, and it's full of vampiric gnomes. And he said, go. And so he gave me that general idea, and then I was able to write Tower of Blood, which is now, it was released through Black Blade Publishing. And so in that particular instance, he gave me the idea and said, please write this. And that was really the only set of parameters he had. It's underground, upside down exploration, and there's vampiric gnomes in there. Please do something with that. But even with that, I had too many 1st edition little quirks in there that the editor ended up taking those out, such as the 1st edition Bard. I love the oddness of the 1st edition Bard. And so the editor said, well, that's a little bit controversial, even in AD&D. Do we like the bard? Do we not like the bard? Psionics, do we like them or not? And so we had to pull some of those out. But in that case, I was given just an idea. But with Bill Webb, and Bill Sippy can verify this, he just said, give us something. And so just, made those things up. And so it depends on the publisher how much freedom they're going to give you.
Yeah. And I mean, if I can pitch in on that answer a little bit, Aaron, when I worked with Gary, it was very much like, here's okay, Citadel's End was something I worked on for Gary Siegsberg project, and it's literally like the fort that is the military outpost in the city. And I was told these knights live in the fort. There are this many personnel. It has this many floors. It has this many rooms, and it occupies these dimensions. Once I had that, though, I was able to really throw some wacky stuff in there. I was originally a little dismayed because I thought, okay, I don't have any latitude to do anything creative, but I started to slowly sort of slipping things in that were, I thought, kind of cool and Gygaxian. I got some Gygax over on Gygax himself. And he was okay with it. So I would say, even if you're handed a fairly rigid outline, go with the idea. And Lance, if you want to shoot this down, you absolutely can. But go with the sense that everything that is not forbidden is permitted. If they don't say, don't put possible monster encounters in it, it's a cathedral, maybe there's a ghost living deep underneath it.
For sure. We all have those instincts as game creators. And I think this is a good place for a ghost, and it makes sense with the scenario that I've written.
Mm-hmm.
I think you're going to find that everybody is going to say that's a great addition. So even if they give you those parameters, feel free. Yeah, that's why they've hired you. That's why they want you to do it, because you're going to come up with those creative things.
Yes.
So yeah, I mean, be as creative as you can.
Yeah, and that's absolutely true. I mean, there's stuff. Just to understand your parameters. I mean, when I first got on the Siegsberg project with Gary, I thought that this was going to be just like total anarchy and total freedom. And the first Citadel I designed, which unfortunately I deleted, it doesn't exist anymore, was like the castle you explore in the video game Dragon's Lair. I mean, it was nuts. I had so much fun with it. I never showed it to anyone. I never gave Gary a progress update. I just worked through for 3 weeks on this ridiculous funhouse dungeon thing. And then Gary sent out an email to all writers. I don't know if his spidey sense was tingling or if somebody sent him something equally absurd that said, hey, I just want to remind you guys, you need to stick with a plan. You need to look through the requirements of what you're writing, and you need to read the source book and so on and et cetera. And I sat down and I looked at what I had done versus the actual thing that Gary wanted, and I was crestfallen. I should have kept it, but I went into the Word document, right click, select all, delete, and started writing anew. So, every time I would click save or it would auto save, it was the new thing that I was working on. But it was like, I think maybe somebody did something equally kind of out there off the reservation of what he wanted. So before you get your heart broken, definitely read what your customer, because that's what they are, what your customer wants out of your project. But with that said, again, I did have a lot of fun, and you can too. You don't have to feel like, you're a galley slave. They've clapped you in irons and clunked a typewriter in front of you and said, I'm gonna stand behind you and crack the whip, and you're gonna, you're just gonna sit there and copy the dictionary, because it doesn't have to
Yeah,
be
you
like that.
were working kind of in sort of a shared world too, so you certainly had to be more aware of the others who were also participating, I guess, in that project. That has to make it more challenging, I
Mm-hmm.
would think, when you have to kind of check on everybody else to make sure it sort of sounds consistent. It's much better, when Bill Webb of Necromancer Games, or now Frog God Games, says, "Hey, I need a module. Send me something that's spooky," and that's his style. He'll send me an email that's got 2 sentences in it, and that's all that he requires of his people. All the great freelancers doing work for Frog God Games really have kind of a pretty broad license to be creative, and that's nice, because that's why I continue to play the game, because I can have all these middle-aged people like me seated around a table, and we get to make up stories, and I get to invent a location and say, here's the location, these are the challenges in it, and they get to make up stuff that's equally bizarre, how they're going to overcome these challenges, and it's super fun.
No, I think that brings us around quite nicely, and big thanks to Aaron on that. To the writing process itself, when you are creating something like, Bill Webb says, I need a module, send me something spooky, or you go through the process of creating something for your own table. Um, Kind of take us through that process from open field to foundation to walls to complete structure, if you will.
Yeah, I think I'll maybe kind of start at the back end of the process, or maybe in the middle of the process, rather, when you're not sure where to go. We all have those initial ideas as game masters and creators and writers, that like, oh, that's a great idea. And in your brain, as you're driving, it sounds great. And then you sit down at the keyboard and you're like, now, how do I actually manifest this? That's kind of where we hit the wall.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the hard part for me anyway. I've got all these great, oh, that's going to be a bestseller. I'll say to myself, what a great plot. It's so original. Man, New York agents are going to be beating down my door to represent this book. And so then I sit down to try to put that idea there, and I get a sentence out. I'm like, okay, why was this such a great idea to begin with? And so I think that's the challenge. And one of my favorite quotes is from William Goldman, who wrote The Princess Bride.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, it ain't about inspiration. It's about going into a room alone and doing it. And so we tend to sit around as creators and wait for inspiration. This muse is going to walk in. But so many times I've just had to sit down and start writing. So if it's a D&D module, I'll just start describing a room and just see where that description goes. And after I get that one room out, that one challenge, that usually lets me wrap the rest of that, maybe say a dungeon complex, around that central image that I've got. So for me, it starts out just with the basics of just write the room description. How many feet across is it? There are 6 pillars tied to the center pillar. There's what appears to be a man covered in tattoos. I'm like, why? Okay, why is this tattooed man tied to the central pillar? And those other little tidbits of information will come to me as I describe him, or I describe one of the tattoos. Okay, why does the tattoo look like that? Okay, maybe that's a clue the players will have to use in this other room. So start with that central image, and I think that works for a novel or short story as well. You start with that central conflict, and maybe write that. So you write out of chronological order, and see what happens. It's easy, I think, in a D&D module to write it outside of chronological order, because it's supposed to be sandboxy, and it doesn't have to follow a linear progression. So maybe work on this one central room that is important to that game, and see what comes from there.
Okay, so with you, it's not necessarily an A to B to C process, but rather you might go into early C and then hop back to A, and then dabble a little bit in B, and then finish up C and come back to B and then back to A.
Yeah, I think Bill and I, we're working on a project, or we have come in talking about it for a while, and we're like, well, how do we get past this, a writer's block that we might have? And so I'll say, Bill, I got this email from you. You got this really cool name for some creature. I don't know what it is, but I love this name you've given it. Why don't you just write about that, this particular monster? And then, so yeah, it could be out of order. Maybe that's not going to happen until point E or F, but write about that monster and then see what happens after that. You may have to go back to A and B.
Yeah, that brings up another very salient point, and that is I myself have been dealing with writer's block, not necessarily creativity block, but writer's block, and you touched on it a little bit with Goldman's statement about going into a room by yourself and just doing it and working up from that, but just for those of you who might be curious, because I want to make this more than just theoretical, more than just hypothetical. As I've said before, I'm working on a sequel, an even tougher sequel to Elemental Moon, and I've I've got some great ideas. I've shared some notes with you, Lance, and I'm just, I sit down and I open up Word and I stare at the page, and I just think, for all the world, if I had some kind of electrodes I could hook to my head or something like that to make these ideas come out onto the screen, how awesome would that be? Because they're just not coming. Like, literally getting them from here to start typing. Do you follow what I'm saying? I mean, I don't know, maybe it's laziness or whatever, but how does one overcome that when the block is almost tangible, almost, you can almost feel a physical barrier, spiritually or creatively, or however you want to assign it, inside you?
Well, you already have the ideas and like just the name of that, a monster. And so then I could write back to you in an email and say, this sounds cool. How does it work? Tell me about this. And so then you're like, okay. And so then you write back an email to me. And before that email is done, you've got the room description or you've got the monster description. And so then I should do this when we get off this call. I'm going to email you back and say, okay, give me a description of these things. And before you know it, you've written all this material that describes these challenges or these monsters. Because I've seen those notes. I'm like, this sounds really cool, where he wants to take this module ultimately to this particular place. I can't wait to see it. So I'm going to have to send you those encouraging emails when we're done here to say, write these things. I want to see what happens next.
Well, I will endeavor to do so, because I'm just, I'm stuck. That's all there is. That's all there is to that. Now you're not just a D&D nerd. You have actually written real books that people want to read, not head cases like us who play tabletop role playing games. Tell us about some of your other works.
Well, even though those works aren't fantasy, it's because of D&D and fantasy that I got into that. I was just kind of this quiet reader who's in seventh grade, and I see kind of this school, the biggest nerd in school. He got picked on more than anybody else in my high school, and so I really avoided him because I didn't want to get drawn into that, because it was tough enough for me as it was. And I see him sitting by himself, and he's got the Holmes Basic book there. I don't know what's Holmes Basic at that time. I just see he's got this book with this kind of interesting image on the cover, and I asked him. I thought, this is a mistake talking to this guy who's going to get beat up probably this time tomorrow and get me in trouble too. I said, what is that? What's interesting? And he said, it's Dungeons and Dragons. And I had never heard those words used in that combination before. Mm-hmm. And so then he shows me this book, and he had this kind of mishmash of books like we all probably started with. You didn't just have a consistent line of books. You had this book, you might have had the 1E Monster Manual, and you had, one of Frank Menser's books, and you cobbled things together, when you're that age. And so I started doing that. And that really was the first time my creative wheel started spinning. And that led me into the dungeon publications. And I thought, well, I would like to write and get paid to write. But honestly, the fantasy market seemed so overwhelming. It's so busy, and there's so many great fantasy authors out there.
Mm-hmm.
And the short stories I was writing just sounded like my D&D adventures, and I didn't want to write that. And so I ended up writing more mainstream mysteries and fictions. And so that's how that went. But all of that is directly because of Dungeons and Dragons. It sounds strange to say.
No, no, not at all. Some it can just be the least little thing that can trigger that. I mean, uh, Tracy Weiss and Margaret Hickman. What did they, how did they roll out? I mean, Tracy was the DM for in a local comic store in I think it was Utah, and I know this fact because a friend of mine who sadly passed away, but his DM was Tracy Hickman. Uh, so, and what's odd I find at the time was he says that Tracy's DMing was nothing like what the Dragonlance modules and stories were like. He was very much a hardcore 1E AD&D unforgiving DM.
Right.
But anyway, the point is that's Weiss and Hickman are tectonic forces in fantasy novels. Now granted it's the range of appeal is probably narrower. I would say that more D&D players know their Dragonlance novels than don't, but same thing. He started out with Dungeons and Dragons and expanded out from there. So is the process the same though when you're writing fiction as it is with D&D? Do you find yourself hopping around? Do you outline? What's that like?
No, there's no outline, but I do hop around because I'll have a central image. Just with that Dungeons and Dragons adventure, I'll think, man, it'd be really, really cool if my players could experience this scenario, and then I'll work something up, from both ends from there. And the novels are the same way. I'll have an idea. Wow, that's a cool mystery. How would someone solve that if they found a dead body and these are the circumstances? How would my detective figure that out? Well, who is my detective? And so the character gets created kind of after the fact, and then you kind of go back in your head. Even though you write it chronologically in my head, I don't put it together. Don't put it together that way. And I think that is true no matter what my creative outlet is at the moment. But it's really nice at the gaming table, as you know, because so much of it we make up as we go. Because the players will do something that we didn't expect, and you have to create that. And so that's another way where we sort of create in the middle. You didn't have a plan for what the players would do if they actually somehow got on top. What's on top of the stronghold? I don't know what's up there. There is a nest of griffins on the top of the stronghold, and the players managed to tame this griffin, and then they fly off. And so where do they encounter that? So I like the idea of making those things up in the middle as the story progresses.
Okay, interesting. So we, as writers of gaming stuff, we have the advantage, as it were, of this being a very chummy business down on this end of it. I should say. I mean, once you start wanting to deal directly with Wizards of the Coast, you've got multiple corporate layers you have to you have to deal with, even if the person you're interfacing with is just as nice and polite on social media or emails or whatever as they can be. Understand that there's a death ray pointed at their head, and the hand of Hasbro's lawyers are on the trigger. But when I approached Bill Webb to do the sequel for Elemental Moon, I literally called Bill Webb and said, "Hey, you remember that Elemental Moon thing that Lance Hawvermale? Yeah. What about a sequel? That sounds good. Okay." that was my pitch and my acceptance letter from from Frog God Games. But getting a book published, man, that's a whole other beast. I mean, if you've got, you know, the Great American Paperback Novel manuscript sitting there on your hard drive or on your desk or whatever, and you're just like, now to get it to somebody, I mean, that is an utterly alien process to me. How does one even do that?
It's not fun. It's my least favorite part of the process because you mentioned that corporate voice and those corporations, the lawyer. You're sending your manuscript off to people who deal in that world. It's a hyper competitive marketplace, and they're probably less concerned about the content of your novel than they are about their ability to sell it. Because we've read books, I know that I have, that were like these huge bestsellers, and
Mm-hmm.
you're like, this is not so great. This is not very original. Why was it such a bestseller? Well, because the corporation put its might behind it. And there have been books that were bestsellers even before they were released because the publisher got on top of it so much and printed so many copies and sent all those copies out. Uh, it's very difficult then for someone to get into the industry. So it's so nice when we can be this chummy companionship. That's why I love the hobby so much, is because it's not political. We're talking about a shared love of games. I don't bring politics into my table.
Mm-hmm.
You and I haven't discussed it at all here. We're talking about our love of gygaxing adventures and these old school guys that we like to work with, and our love of storytelling and of watching characters at the table do heroic things.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's really why I love the hobby, and will continue to do it despite of any success or lack of success in my other writing.
So if you're a first time novelist, what is your game plan if you do have that great American novel? I mean, get an agent first, cold emails, what?
Yeah, so I guess there are two options. If you're someone that's already got some sort of voice, like you're a popular personality on you, even moderately popular on YouTube, or you have a podcast that has X number of listeners, that's going to work to your advantage.
Mm-hmm.
Because the other option is just cold. You're mailing off to a bunch of agents that seem to represent the same material that you write, and you introduce yourself, and you live and die in this one-page query letter that tries to explain who you are, why your book is original, and why they need to request to see some of your sample chapters. And I've done that for 20 some years, and it's hard, and
Mm-hmm.
it's cold, and it's really cruel, and you get these rejection letters. I've gotten so many of them, and it's tough. So I think this day and age, though, we kind of have a way to get in, and you can build an audience through other means, through your live streaming, through blogs, through YouTube, whatever, and then you're able to approach that agent and say, hey, I've got this built-in audience. Here's my idea, and look at all my followers on Twitter. I have X number of followers on Twitter. And so I think being able to leverage social media and our popularity on that gives us a bit of advantage. Otherwise, you are just mailing that off to some person that you've never seen before and praying for the best.
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting about this. So yeah, I never thought about that as an in as it were. Now, one of the things, and I don't know how this applies to the world of novels of fiction, but I had Don McVitie on last week, and Don and I don't know if you guys have interacted. He's got his own game publishing company, Hellebard. His advice to people doing RPG stuff is just self-publish right now. Just the market is soft enough for adventures and so on, and it is pretty easy. I mean, if you can get somebody to help you get your stuff organized into a PDF, you can set it out there on DriveThruRPG and not sweat so much about shopping it, like, oh, does Necromancer want this, does Troll Lord want you can literally put it out there, and as time goes by, as you say, as you build a presence, if you decide at some point, like, yeah, I'd like to kick this up a little bit, I can then turn around and say, look at what I have on uh, drive through, and look at my sales. I want to come and write for you guys. But I guess it's a definitely a horse of a different color when it comes to an actual novel that self publication is. I mean, is that an option? I was
Yeah, it
just.
is an option, and I think the story is that John Grisham, of all the lawyer novels, I think
Mhm.
he self-published his very first one, that was the Tom Cruise movie. We're talking now, what, 30 years ago, right? I
Yeah.
think he self-published that, and this was in a day before self-publishing was a thing. And then he went around, using his own money as a lawyer. You got a lot of money to do that, to self-promote.
Mhm.
And eventually he had sold enough copies that he said to a publishing house, "Hey, I've managed to sell 10,000 copies on my own. Would you guys like to publish that?" And so that is a viable route. There's lots of stories online about people who started off through self-publishing. A lot of people sell on Amazon and make a good living
Mm.
just through self-published works that are just published digitally, and they may sell for $3 a copy. But you get 1,000 people to buy that at $3 a copy. It's nice to have an extra $3,000.
No, no kidding. No kidding.
Yeah, so definitely it is a good option, and people make a good living in self-publishing, and I'm so glad that it exists.
Good. Good. That was because that answers my next question. What are your thoughts on it? I mean, I feel like there was a bit of a. This is just my perception as a guy. Like, my only stuff is fantasy stereo instructions through Frog God. But just my perceptions was that maybe there was a bit of a bit of elitism, if you will, about
Yeah, there's a
self-published
stigma
stuff.
attached to it in the publishing industry. There is a stigma. Oh, this was just self-published, and they
Hmm.
say it like it was just self-published because there's so much, just like in the D20 era, that's just not good, in the self-publishing industry. So it still has to struggle against that stigma, but that's becoming less and less as the years go on. People today can make quality records, at home. They don't need the record deal. They can write quality novels and D&D modules at home and self-publish those.
Right, right. So I think it's awesome now that hopefully that's lifted. So if you are the aspiring novelist, you don't have to feel like, you know, you're going to be getting the stink eye from people. It's like, yeah, you just went out and had, 10,000 copies of that printed. So what? That just means you wasted your money. There's this very funny British sitcom, and I can't remember the actor now. I've gone blank, but it's called I'm Alan Partridge, and he plays this horribly obnoxious DJ. He's the chaotic evil to Fraser Crane's lawful good when it comes to talk radio disc jockeys. And his he wrote an autobiography. Like, nobody gives a damn about the guy, right? But he wrote his autobiography anyway, and he self-published, and he literally has like enough copies that in the end scene of an episode, he's like throwing them on his fireplace to keep warm. so
Yeah, if
so
you're going to self-publish, I recommend maybe not buying all those copies.
yeah.
Just buy enough. Your book signing, you go to the local bookstore, you've set up something at the indie bookstore, you bring in 20 copies, you tell all your friends and family to come, and maybe they're the only people that show up. I've been there before. You're at a book signing, and the only people who show up are your friends and family. You know what? You move 20 copies, and that's a start, and you just build on that momentum.
Yes. Yes. I mean, I have actually, I can say I have done a book signing before myself, not worked it, not helped set it up. Tracy Lesh and I did a signing for Lost Crypt, and we didn't move tons, but we had a good time. We had a lot of fun. So don't be afraid that if you do self publish, and do what Lance says. If you moved that, that's 10 or 20 copies you sold right there. And you have a good time with it. More questions from Aaron. Who's your favorite author, Lance?
I'm a huge Ray Bradbury fan. And if I were to pick up my computer and move it around, you'd see lots of Ray Bradbury stuff. When I was in high school, I read Something Wicked This Way Comes. And I remember thinking, this guy has used nouns as adjectives, and no one ever told me that was okay. And it sounds really cool when he does it, though. And so, how does he do that? And so, I would read more of Bradbury. Then I would try to write in that vein. So, he was doing something I hadn't seen before, and that's always exciting. And so, that's lived with me ever since then. Is my love of. He may not be the most intellectual of all writers, but he's always lived with me because he does things so differently than other writers, and certainly he has a big crossover with fantasy and science fiction, and that plays right to my strength. So Mr. Ray Bradbury is my favorite author of all time.
Bradbury is pretty stellar. Fahrenheit 451 was one of the first novels that I ever finished and started again immediately.
Really, yeah, yeah. I teach that one in class even, so Bradbury's had a huge influence on my life.
Yes, I think we could probably really go off the rails talking about Fahrenheit 451. That is such an amazing piece of work. But let's see. Do you ever write novels or modules and then take them to a publisher and try to sell it to them? We kind of answered Aaron's second question there first, with talking about the process of getting it out there.
I think you mentioned drive-through. That's the best outlet, really. If you just get that module published in a really nice looking PDF, that you have some art in there. Maybe it's just stock art that you've purchased the rights to use. You got to have some art, but make it. It doesn't have to be very long, but just make it look nice, and then do what you can on social media to sell it.
Mm-hmm.
And see what kind of momentum that you can build up, and then maybe you'll write something that's a bit longer, and then you can approach somebody. You can call up Bill Webb and say, hey man, I got this great idea. You never know.
Guilty as charged. A funny thing about art, and this is definitely something you can try if you're feeling bold. The first self-published modules, and by self-published I mean I hand built the PDFs in Microsoft Word, and stuck them on my little website, all 3 megabytes that I was allotted by my cable internet provider back in '99. I took screenshots from some fantasy video game and ran them through a few noise filters so they would not look like screenshots from a computer game. They'd look like watercolors, and used those. So if you're strapped for art, trust me, you can find it.
But that process is really in the spirit of all the zines from back in the day. They're stapled in the middle by hand on the mimeograph machine. They're printed. Our hobby has a great history of doing exactly what you just said, and that's part of that rich tradition that I really like.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, and I did on a couple of projects beg some art that was absolutely gorgeous from the creators, but yeah, by and large, I mean, I was doing screenshots, miniature photos. I just got our digital camera out, and set up some miniatures, set up some Dwarven Forge, got some pretty good lighting, snapped some pictures, and again, ran it through some filters so it didn't look like photographs of miniatures. It looked different. So, yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. That is definitely in the spirit of what we do, is just going out and just forging stuff yourself. You don't. We're lucky enough, and I think you'll agree with me on this, Lance, that we live in a time where that's now a thing. I remember the first thing I ever offered for publication, and I've told this story many times. I hand wrote, like, pencil or pen I think I did it in pen because I wanted it to look more professional. But I hand wrote an entire D&D module and drew all the maps and taped it all together and everything, and mailed it to TSR. So I've had that DIY spirit with me for a long time. Now I received no ping back from them at all. I didn't even get a no thank you rejection letter. Just like it just went out into the void. But fortunately, now you can pester people like Bill Webb. I'm not telling you to, please don't run out and bother Bill Webb and say, but Bill Sylvie and Lance Hawvermale told me to do this.
Right.
Bill will ship us poisoned beers or something. I don't know. But, no, it is an insular community, and it is an easy enough entry point now that you don't have to be afraid to fire something out and expect to get no response. There are companies who are not going to respond to you. Wizards of the Coast, I think, is just, they're not. They have a process of getting stuff to them to publish, and I'm not putting words in your mouth, Lance, but we don't follow that.
Right. Just keep in mind what system that you're writing for. I think that's important too.
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to write something that you think, I'm going to market this specifically to the crowd that likes tunnels and trolls or whatever your system is, make sure that you're writing it in that spirit and that you're marketing it. Don't make it so general that you're trying to appeal to people, who are my age and people who are 25, who grew up with fourth and fifth edition. Make sure you know your audience, whatever you're writing.
Okay, another question we have. This is Chris Spiller says, you said you'd done a Greyhawk module when the serial numbers filed off. What's your favorite part of the Flayanus? There's so much that's evocative on the old Darlene map that I'd still love to explore. So we've got a couple of weeks to kill. We're going to go on vacation. We're going to hit the Flayanus. Where do you want to go? And why?
It's you mentioned the Darlene map, and I was at the North Texas RPG Con a few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wandering kind of through the dealer's hall there, and I stop and look at my program. I look to the right, and there's a table, and Darlene is sitting at the table.
Yes.
And there's no one else around. And I'm having this moment like I can remember I have her map hanging on my wall in high school, and here I am, this middle-aged guy, and I'm having this reaction to her sitting here. This is not answering the question at all. This is just my Darlene out story.
That's
and I went up to her and told
her, one too.
I had your map on my wall. This sounds stupid to be saying this to you. And so we had a really nice conversation, and she had published, self-published, I believe, a coloring book,
yes,
fantasy coloring book, that she autographed from my daughter. So that was really cool to get that coloring book from Darlene. But I think in the world of Greyhawk, we did most of our adventuring in, if you know where the Grand March is, if you can see your Greyhawk map in your mind, and there's the Grand March, and there's the Jeff is over there, Geoff, that area. We spent a lot, we spent a lot of time over there. And of course the Great Kingdom is nice. It's got that, it's got a pretty rich history. There's been a lot written about it. Not all of it's canon that's been written about it, but that's also a nice area. But if we were going to stay on, there's two maps, so we're on the left map. That would have been the west side, the Sea of Dust. It was a great. I just like seeing the Sea of Dust on the map because I'm like, there's this huge space of real estate dedicated to nothingness, just this emptiness.
Mm-hmm.
What are all the great things that I can put there? Okay. And so it was kind of the negative space on the map that really drew my attention. I wanted to populate that area and have adventures there. So that was our quadrant of the map.
Yeah, the Sea of Dust, and if you know your Greyhawk lore, that was once this verdant kingdom.
Yes.
And it essentially got nuked.
Yes.
The Sea of Dust is the result of a nuclear exchange.
Yeah, we definitely played it with kind of a post-apocalyptic feel. I think we had too much Mad Max influence, maybe. The films were really popular at that time, so we probably had too much crossover in our game at that point.
Nice. But that I actually chose the Sea of Dust for one of my first modules. WGR 2 Temple of the Sun is set in the sea of dust. Just it's too cool. You think, oh, it's just an open empty desert. No. There's a lot of groovy stuff in there. Um, things you can explore and all. And if I could just interject real quick, yes, Darlene is awesome, and I will, as soon as I get the link, or as soon as I get the video posted, I have an hour plus interview with Darlene. If you'd like to, if you folks would like to see that, I will let you know just as quick as it goes up, because Darlene is she's an interesting lady, and she has a lot of very cool stories about the creative process of art, and so on and etc. So, oh, just a comment from Chris here. The invoked devastation, reign of colorless fire was Gary's way to make the world of Greyhawk a semi-post-apocalypse setting. IMO. Yeah, definitely. I mean, like you and I were just discussing, Greyhawk is a post-apocalypse setting. Prove me wrong. I'm like what's his name, Crowder. Greyhawk is a post-apocalypse setting. Prove me wrong. Louder with Delver.
Reign of colorless fire. I mean, that's just a great term. The reign of colorless fire. I mean, you just tell me that, and I'm ready to create something, because it's so interesting. And so I think that's where that creative process starts. Just a cool title. Wow, that's neat. What is that all about?
I mean, the professor himself. He wrote in the margin of a paper, and I can't help but wonder that if sitting in somebody in a shoebox or something somewhere is the homework paper returned to the student that has scratched in the margin, in a hole in the ground lived a hobbit. Right, I mean, that right. JRRT was bored out of his mind grading papers and just wrote that down on the margin of a paper. And what more be said about that? So yeah, it can listen to this man. He knows little ideas can jumpstart huge things. So that's definitely to be don't discard your mental notes, I guess, is what I'm trying very badly to
all those things. And have a piece of paper that has all these random phrases, or just sounds, or names of monsters, or towns, or NPCs, or something, and then just build on whichever of those inspires you the most.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Sometimes the creative process is literally just that simple. I mean, now you probably know this, Lance, but for any of the listeners or viewers who may not, all those cool names, like if you go through the Giants modules and some of the others where Gary has named NPCs, those are all insults. Their names are from a book of mild to harsh insults in Old English times, like from the Middle Ages. Gary had a book of those, and he made them character names. So it's like Gleepworp the Eyebiter. Okay, that's kind of silly, but sort of cool. Yeah, no, that's like you're dumbass the asshole or whatever. Right. But we didn't know that. I mean, that wasn't until I was like in my 40s when I found that out, and it just kind of gave me a chuckle. But there's no limit on really where you can take inspiration from, and I think you'll agree with me there, Lance. But I have interrupted you, and I didn't intend to. I do actually have a question for you. So, does the family game with you?
We have started. My daughters range from 6 to 16, so we've started with, I don't know, call it role playing light, maybe. Mm-hmm. So all the creativity is there, but the rules are very scant, very basic. So not necessarily D&D like, just a pool of dice because we like rolling lots of dice. When you're 6, you like rolling lots of dice. Even when you're 14, even when you're 44, you like rolling lots of dice, whatever your age is. So we have done some homebrew role playing for sure during the pandemic. We have acquired a lot more board games than we used to have to get us through, but that remains an important part of certainly of my creative life, and I hope that my daughters speak kindly of it when they talk about those sessions outside of our house.
Well, I'm sure they will. I'm quite sure they will. When it comes to playing games with your kids, do you ever play any dungeon? I find it's a great entry point.
Yeah, there are a lot of board games these days that try to simulate some of those experiences. Board games are in this kind of crazy renaissance now.
Yeah,
and
it's
so
nuts.
you can find a board game for really any particular interest that you have, but ones that simulate the D&D experience, because now D&D is very popular. The film is coming out, I guess, for better or for worse. And so, yeah, we do that. We also just play some games with some. You mentioned Dwarven Forge. We have a lot of pieces of those, so we just build dungeons and put some minis in there. And okay, let's talk about what happens next. And which mini do you choose? And of course, the girls like to go over all the minis and choose just that exact one that represents them.
Yes.
And we kind of make it up as we go along. So yeah, we use all of our things to tell stories.
You just made up some stuff that you thought would be fun, and I think that is at the essence, the core of great gamesmanship in D&D is just like, what would be fun? Is this fun? Let's keep doing this. Is this fun? No, let's not do that.
Yes. And it's so easy to get new player, because they'll ask me, like some of my students will say, hey, they'll just know me as this English instructor. I saw on your website you do this gaming stuff, and what is that about? And so it's so easy just to say, like I could do to you sitting right here. Okay, you're in this room, and I describe their setting, and then I'll say those magic words. I'll say, what do you do? And they'll be like, what do you mean? What do I do? What are my rules? What's the rules? There's no rules. You're in this room. There's a dagger on the table. There's a chest in the corner. There's a rolled up piece of paper, and there are 2 doors, east and west. What do you do? And there'll be this moment where they're hesitant, and they're like, I get up and go to the door. And then they'll realize they can do anything they want, and then they're hooked. And they don't want you to stop. Like, can we just go a little bit more? Because
Yes.
it propels their imagination in new ways.
Yeah, I mean, once you create a gamer, I mean, once you really get somebody at the table, you will create a hunger and a thirst in them. You need never worry about players once you've got a good inspired group going, whether you're doing a board game like Dungeon or Hero Quest or even something like Space Hulk. But don't give Games Workshop your money. Please don't. That's just not me to you, Lance, but me to everybody. Don't give Games Workshop your money. But whatever you do gaming tabletop wise, you will create the desire. You need never worry again about, gosh, will those people like to do this? I have found that for the most part, although I haven't quite invented the secret sauce to get my daughters at the table yet, but for the most part, yeah, it is just a case of, as you say, present it. You're in a room, there's a door to the east and the west, table in front of you, something's pounding on the door to the east. What do you do?
Yeah. And my best story, I'm going to have to conclude this story and head back to campus, but my best story that directly relates to that, I used to be what was known as a youth guidance specialist, and I worked at a residential campus for at-risk boys. And so boys ages maybe 9 to 17 would be sent there. They hadn't broken the law, but they were kind of walking that line. And so their school or their parents had sent them to this kind of boys' home to kind of get back on track. And they were all tough. When you're that age, you gotta, in the city, you gotta act tough and be tough and get respect. And so that's kind of their attitude. And we're at the recreation time, and it was raining, and so they couldn't be outside. We were under a gazebo. And so I just started spontaneously giving them, one of those scenarios where you're in the room and there's someone pounding on the door, whatever it was. And I started telling that to them, and they were super hesitant because they are these, tough young guys. And I lured them in, and it got to the point where they would be talking about that during their morning activity, waiting to get to the afternoon. We didn't have any dice. We weren't rolling dice. I was just telling them what happened based on their actions. And they loved it so much. It was so new to their imagination that they're talking about it at 10 a.m. And we don't have our rec time's not till 4. And it was just such a great thing to go home and talk to my wife about, that these guys were so into their imaginations and being heroes, and doing heroic things in an imaginary setting. I would like to think, that it made their time really positive and they took something away from it.
Well, you are a master storyteller. You're an accomplished writer. You're a dad. I cannot imagine that it did not give them something positive to take away from that experience and positively influence them. Lance, it has been an absolute gas having you on. So you'll be back later, not later today, obviously, but I will pull you back onto this platform again. I hope in the not too distant future. Thank you for taking your time out today. Lance Hawvermale, everyone, writer, dad, adventure creator, and we didn't get into it, but miniature painter also.
I'm not very good. I can paint the minis when they're a little bit larger. I'm not to the good
I want to see the hut of the Baba Yaga. I think you sent me an in progress.
I did.
But I do want to see the hut of the Baba Yaga as a complete piece. Folks, thank you all for listening. Check out Lance's stuff. Look him. Do you have an Amazon page, Lance, that people can find?
They can just go to my website, lancehawvermale.com. I have that up there. But yeah, all my stuff's at Amazon for sure.
Okay. All right. Thank you again, Lance. Have an absolutely wonderful day, and we will see you next time.
Thanks, man. I'm going to email you and send you some of those harassing emails for your stuff.
I look forward to it.
You're going to roll, man. Thanks.
All right. Take care. And folks, I think that's where we're going to leave off today. I got some honeydews to do, and I will see you all later. Peace. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you tomorrow.